Why don't we take John Loftus's questions? These are questions that were pre-submitted ahead of time. John Loftus, for those of you who don't know, is a former student of William Lane Craig who has apostatized and has edited and written many books against Christianity. He says, would you comment on this quote? The minimal facts approach is not a fair approach to the data, to say the least. By virtue of any disagreements, it's not fair for their side to take off the table any facts the other side objects to. That is special pleading, pure and simple, in favor of Christian scholarship. So what is offered are minimal facts, are not minimal facts, not all the facts. So what is offered are minimal facts, not all the facts. What is needed is a sound argument for why apologists can arbitrarily exclude certain things from the discussion. Only if both sides agree on this can apologists Habermas and Licona go ahead and make their case. But skeptics, atheists, and agnostics don't. I personally think that he's not really understanding the minimal facts approach, which is to say that the minimal facts advocates such as Habermas and Licona are saying that they're tying their hand behind their back by using only data which enjoys the consensus of scholarly support, and so it doesn't seem like they're special pleading, but rather trying to tie their hand behind their back here. So even though I don't utilize the minimal facts apologetic, I don't think this is a very fair objection.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say exactly that. If anything, what they're excluding is they're deliberately excluding things that might tell in favor of their argument. So it's I'm not a fan of minimal facts, but that's not the criticism I would make at all. And if someone thinks they're leaving something out that's contrary to, Christianity or to the resurrection in a debate context, that's the perfect place to bring that up. And of course, Bart Ehrman and those guys do that. And Mike Licona and Gary Habermas, they go out and they debate them and they answer what they try to bring up as counter evidence, but they're not doing minimal facts in order to leave out counter evidence. In a sense, they're doing minimal facts in order to base it on something that they think their opponent is going to grant. I think that's too limiting myself, but as Jonathan says, not for that reason.
I'll just add that in my article on miracles for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which you can read online for free, I specifically discuss the minimal facts approach and draw attention to the fact that one move one can make is to adduce other facts, also widely agreed upon, that would be better explained by the miracles not having taken place. Now, it's up to the scholar to try to find such facts if he can, but I actually go out of my way to say, well, this is a way that one could try to respond to this kind of an argument. So it's hardly like we're trying to hide something here. I'm a maximal data guy myself, but that's just not a fair criticism of the minimal facts approach.
I agree. Okay, he has another question that he submitted. He says, would you please make 3 distinctions, then answer the question that follows. 1, do you differentiate between objective evidence coming from artifacts, astronomy, geology, genetics, archaeology, philology, DNA, clinical trials, cell phones, and testimonial evidence coming from people who say they saw a miracle? Testimonial evidence is weak by comparison.
Whoa. Let's just stop right there with the first one. Hello? Where did we get that? This is like cargo cult epistemology. We're going to do this all really simply with just this one distinction. It's direct or it's indirect, and that's all there is to it. If you try to go that way, you'll get yourself tangled up even in non-religious contexts. An X-ray is a physical object. I assume that would count as some kind of direct evidence. The word of a doctor is testimonial. But if you hand me the X-ray, I may have no idea what to make of it in terms of whether I have a particular kind of problem or not. Whereas if my doctor, without showing me the physical X-ray, says, well, I've looked at your X-ray and here's what I see, I'm going to be rationally much more confident in his word than I am in something I glean from the object. Physical objects are not actually literally self-interpreting, and there are often layers of inference that go on. And so that this idea that testimony is some kind of second-class evidence is just really, truly silly. We get most of our knowledge, most of us get our knowledge even of what the facts are, of what the archaeological facts are, by testimony from people who claim to be, have seen them. So we already have a layer of testimony works in there. There are ways that testimonial evidence can be integrated with other testimonial evidence and with external clues that are very interesting and powerful. The texture of eyewitness testimony, not just the fact that somebody said X happened, but the way that he says it, the things he includes and leaves out, and the way those dovetail or fail to dovetail with other things. These are all tremendously interesting. And to treat this as though it's just a direct or indirect thing and flatten it all out like that and then plant one's flag and sail away is more than merely naive. This is a kind of special pleading in its own right.
It's scientism in action, or it smacks of that. It may not be, but it certainly has that flavor that we have to have it scientifically, or else we don't have it. And that's just, that's going the wrong direction.
And ironically, all scientific papers are testimony, right?
Yes.
Someone's giving testimony. Yeah. This is the results that they received, right? This is their data.
Yeah.
You haven't repeated all of the experiments from the paper. So he says, testimonial evidence over time is weaker by comparison. Hearsay testimonial evidence over time is very weak by comparison. Hearsay testimonial evidence coming from the pre-scientific world of superstitious people is extremely weak evidence. Excuse me.
I'm going to cut in again. Just how ignorant was a first century Jew?
These were the people, Tim, these were the people who didn't know that virgins didn't have kids. These are the people who didn't know that you don't rise from the grave.
Yeah, I mean, these people live closer to birth and death than most of us. They saw executions. A shepherd who's birthing lambs out in the field knows something about where big lambs come from. They come from little lambs, which come from their mommies, which come from sex. This was not an ignorant population. It's as though they would have needed to understand quantum chromodynamics in order to be able to give fair testimony to whether someone was living or dead.
If they'd been that ignorant, they wouldn't have known it was a miracle.
That's just bizarre. Why would you?
So what's happening here
John
is
Loftus.
He's got like three things, and he's like, "Will you acknowledge these three things?" And then, answer the question that follows. And what I think we're seeing is we're going to go, no. No, we're not.
So far.
No, not that one. No, not that one either. And nope, not that one. By the time we get to the question, it'll be interesting to see what happens. All right, go.
And what's funny as well is that Theophilus of Antioch, who was a 2nd century church father, he has a dialogue, he writes an apology to Autolycus, who was a pagan, and he says, "Now, as to your saying that the dead are not raised, for you say, show us even one who's been raised from the dead, that seeing we may believe," right? And Justin Martyr also in his first apology has a section where he defends the possibility of resurrection to people who are skeptical of the possibility of resurrection. So I think that Mr. Loftus is very misguided here. So he goes on. He says, objective evidence doesn't lie. People do. People misunderstand and mischaracterize. Most people believe first and ask questions later. Thinking like a scientist is a learned skill.
Okay, I mean, where to begin? Where to begin with this? It's like saying the evidence you have is testimony, and some testimony is worthless, therefore the evidence you have is worthless. I might as well say the evidence for atheism is in some books, and some books are worthless, so the evidence for atheism is worthless. That would be just as good of an argument, and of course it's terrible, and Loftus should disagree and object vociferously to it. But that's the same reason that I'm objecting to his argument. That's just that's a silly way to go about trying to assess the weight of evidence, as though you could just put your hand over your eyes and say, wait, it's called testimony, therefore I know it's weak. That just doesn't work. That's not how any of this works.
Let me also point out here, and I don't want to sound like I'm, belong to the Innocence Project or something, but the idea that physical evidence and self-interpreting has sent innocent people to jail. So now I did not get a chance to look up this story before coming on here. I did know about this question and I had intended to. Somebody can maybe look it up, but I read something a year or two ago about hair evidence in criminal trials, and that and I guess this was before DNA evidence was involved, but actually looking at different types of hair that were found on the scene of a crime and concluding that the accused had committed the crime. It gave so the article claimed, a false impression of objectivity to the conviction that this had to be this guy's hair, that was found on the scene of the crime. This is how I remember the story at any rate. And so then the person would be convicted. And then it was later discovered that this was very difficult to interpret as to whether it was definitely this person's hair, rather than someone else's hair. It might have been the other way around if he had the victim's hair, in his car or something like that. But that, without something more fine-grained, as it were, saying that this hair definitely belongs to this person is much harder than the expert witnesses gave the impression of. And so then people were convicted on this basis and later had their convictions questioned or possibly overturned. But that kind of arises from that kind of naive scientism that says, as he said right there, physical evidence doesn't lie. So then what we do is we overleap it to say, therefore, my interpretation of the physical evidence is something that you must accept. That's kind of the road to prosecutorial hell. So I just wanted to point that out.
It's very idealistic, and it's also very extremely epistemologically limiting, because the kind of objective evidence that he will allow as evidence could only lead to a naturalistic conclusion, because he's only looking for evidence that can apply to the natural sciences, and that's just question begging all to pieces. That's.
Let me just add something to that, Tom, and this is very much in line with what you're saying. There's nothing wrong with doing natural science. I love natural science. Jonathan is a scientist. This is not the place where we're trying to dump on natural science.
No.
But if you're looking...
And Tim, too, if I may, I grew up it was called the Chemical City. There were more PhD scientists where I grew up, where I was born, Midland, Michigan, than any non-university town in America. I'm with you on that.
Yeah, but when we're talking about what is detectable by a method that is set up to detect natural causes, that's kind of like asking what you can do with a metal detector. If I get a metal detector, I can find the studs in my wall, I can find little scraps of metal that people have dropped on the beach. I may occasionally even find something bigger like a watch, but it's always going to be metal stuff. If I'm wondering where I mislaid my plastic comb and I go searching for it with my metal detector and I don't find it, I'm not going to conclude that the comb doesn't exist because the metal detector doesn't pick it up. Your methods may be great at finding certain kinds of things and just not the right kinds of methods for finding other real things. We have to be flexible enough about this to try to say, all right, we're just looking for good evidence. We don't want to do special pleading, but we don't want to do special pleading in the other direction either. So to limit yourself to just what can be detected as physical is to limit yourself to not detecting non-physical things and realities if they are really there. And a rule of thinking that would make it impossible for me to know a certain kind of truth if it were really true is an unreasonable rule.
Let me also add that the kind of evidence that Loftus is talking about there actually can be relevant to detecting non-physical entities and even to a theistic conclusion. So, for example, if you read Colin Hemer, he'll be talking about inscriptions. So you want archaeology, get the Book of Acts and the study of Hellenistic history. It's amazing. So you'll have inscriptions that show us things about different provinces in Asia Minor and so forth. And then you go and you read the Book of Acts and it implies the same thing about the language or whether something was in the same province, whether it was in a different province or the names that were used or what gods were worshipped or that kind of thing. And so this shows the reliability of the Book of Acts, which in turn is pertinent to the reliability of Luke, which in turn is pertinent to the resurrection accounts in the book of Luke, which in turn is pertinent to the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, I am not saying, please, I know skeptics are going to go out there. Lydia just said that because there's an inscription somewhere in Asia Minor that this means Jesus rose from the dead. I just said is pertinent too, okay? But that there is a line by which we actually have data from archaeology that does tend to confirm a a religious conclusion. And in the same way, for example, not to go way off topic, but the data concerning the DNA in the cell, for example, is certainly pertinent to a religious conclusion. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can even, I'm not going to say accept Loftus's limitation, but simply say, oh, great, you want to talk about stuff that I can look at under a microscope or stuff that I can look at on an inscription. Well, yeah, we got that too. So it's all going in that direction.
Okay, let me continue his second question that he wants to ask. Do you also differentiate between evidence that directly confirms what you believe from evidence that's merely consistent with what you believe? Even if we accept that the body of Jesus might be missing, that doesn't prove he was raised from the dead, not by a long shot.
Does anyone say it does?
No.
I mean,
prove and confirm. Prove is one thing. Confirm. You use confirm and you use prove, and you've got two epistemologists, somebody who's really interested in this stuff, and a scientist, all in the panel, and they're going to go, oh, they're going to start face palming. I see Tim's double face palming. He needs more hands to do more face palms. Okay. And Loftus is trying to say that something that doesn't prove also doesn't confirm. That's not true. So, I mean, that's where Tom was bursting out. Did anybody say it proves it? But to confirm, somebody brought up Richard Swinburne earlier, is to make something more probable than it would be without it. That's a sort of a general definition of confirmatory evidence, that if we didn't have this evidence, it would be less probable than when we do have this evidence. And then you can have it be even, we can even say strongly confirmed. Certainly if Jesus' body was not there, it does not logically entail that he rose from the dead. But it also definitely strongly confirms it, which is a lot more than merely being compatible with it, that there are 250 penguins currently on a certain ice floe in Antarctica is compatible with it, but neither confirms nor disconfirms, at least as far as I can see. So, but the absence of Jesus' body obviously does confirm.
Absolutely. And he goes on. So he asks a third question. Do you admit there's a distinction between ordinary claims and miraculous claims, and the ordinary claims don't require a great amount of quality evidence for them, whereas miraculous claims do? And this last distinction, just think of the virgin birth claim of Mary and the dream story of Joseph that convinced him she was telling the truth, along with the inclusion of his dream story into the Gospel of Matthew.
Okay, so there are non-miraculous claims that are less probable than many miraculous claims. So I could make one up right here. My aunt Ellen is currently winning a game of Scrabble with a final score of 432 while sipping mint tea with the tip of her nose, exactly 2.7 parsecs from the second largest asteroid in our solar system, which, etc. Right, I'll just go adding conjuncts onto this until I have something so ridiculously complex and improbable that it is less probable than that Jesus rose from the dead. It's just not true that you can park all of the supernatural claims at the low end of the spectrum and all the natural non-miraculous claims at somewhere higher up on it and sort them that way. That's David Hume's dream. It is Bart Ehrman's dream, but it's just not true. So no, there is not in general that kind of a division. Now, that being said, may you ask legitimately for more evidence that a man rose from the dead than that he rose from bed this morning? Yes, absolutely. And the Christians have been saying this for a long time, since before David Hume. So if you look, for example, at Thomas Sherlock's book, The Trial of the Witnesses of the Resurrection, the advocate for the Christians there expressly says, yes, of course, you can ask for more evidence, but you can't demand more evidence than could in principle be given. That's unreasonable. Then you're placing it beyond the reach of evidence, and you're not asking to be responsive to evidence. You're instead asking for an excuse to not respond to the evidence. That's an illegitimate move.
Christians have been saying for a long time that this is an amazing thing. And I believe there's a famous passage by G.K. Chesterton about this. You know, oh yes, there is something a bit odd about a virgin conceiving. No kidding. We have said, bring it on. What we Christians have said is, yes, our claims do require a lot of evidence, and if we got a show for you, we have the evidence. We are ready to present the evidence. So as far as any reasonable claim that, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, when you make it reasonable, like Tim was distinguishing a reasonable claim of that kind or a requirement from an unreasonable one, you make a reasonable one. And I don't believe that that's a question begging thing to do. Oh, reasonable means something that I know I can satisfy, like I'm gerrymandering it or something, but just you're willing to be convinced by the evidence, then I think we've got that. I think we've got that covered. Whereas, quite frankly, there are miracle claims that may be even true. So, some of the things Craig Keener has researched, I'm not saying that they're false, but that some of those don't necessarily have the same level of evidence that the resurrection has for it. I don't believe every miracle claim that I hear. And nowhere close to it. I'm not saying Craig Keener does either, don't misunderstand me. But what I'm just trying to say is, yeah, I'm all in favor of a certain amount of antecedent tough-mindedness, antecedent skepticism, if I may so put it, which we then allow ourselves to overcome if in fact the evidence warrants doing so.
And you used that word gerrymandering, Lydia. There's a sense almost in which I think John Loftus gerrymandered the question when he put in the point about the dreams. What kind of, are we accepting those based on, what kind of evidence do we have for those? Well, I don't know of anybody who starts there in defending the whole birth narrative. Nobody starts there. I come to a confidence in the truth of that narrative after I come to a confidence in the truth in the whole. And that starts in places where I can reasonably start. Okay, we have a very, very reliable story here. I'll accept that as part of it. I don't start there. Why should I? And why should he expect us to? I think he picked something that he thought we would be embarrassed by. I'm not. I just don't start there.
Okay, so one point I also raised in my debate with Peter Atkins was that when people talk about extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence, echoing that famous catchphrase or slogan from Carl Sagan, people typically understand that, or at least in the skeptical community, as having a single piece of spectacular evidence. But what can, in principle, be accomplished by one single spectacular piece of evidence can, in principle, also be accomplished by numerous pieces of weaker or insufficient evidences. And Peter Atkins didn't agree with that, and he dismissed that point completely, said that there's no such thing as weak evidence.
Well, I think, what he may have been assuming is that you were talking about something that is so weak that it doesn't scarcely merits, being mentioned. And I know I tend to go, and I don't want to lose people with like talking mathy stuff, but something that, let's just put it this way, it's just virtually worthless. The way I would express that would be it scarcely has a top-heavy Bayes factor at all, because that's the way we talk around here. But another way to put it is it's something that's just like, why even bother mentioning this? So I'll sometimes say the fact that I have not heard from a man named Henry Pumpernickel today is some evidence that Henry Pumpernickel does not exist. And in that sense, I've received evidence for an infinite number of claims today, because there's an infinite number of people who have not written email to me today. So in that sense, it's not even worth mentioning. And so I think probably when someone like Peter Atkins hears you say that, he thinks that you're talking about evidence that's not even worth mentioning. Okay. Whereas you're talking about something that has some amount of weight to it, but it's not sufficient all by itself to carry the weight. And then we can combine those into a cumulative case that's worth taking note of.
Maybe sufficient and insufficient evidences would be better nomenclature for that. But I'll also add one other point about the dream story in Matthew. One evidence that one could adduce for that is the fact that Matthew's account is told exclusively from the perspective of Joseph, and Luke's account is told exclusively and consistently from the perspective of Mary, including what was going on in their respective minds at the time and so forth. And that is, very expected on the hypothesis that this is actually witness testimony that's going back, in Luke's case, to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and in Matthew's case, to Joseph, the father of Jesus. And so the fact that he's relating what was going on in his mind and the dream that he had and everything may well be consistent with that being grounded in reality as well. Okay. He says, so Loftus continues, he says, now for the question. Since you don't have any objective evidence that specifically confirms the miraculous resurrection of Jesus, and although the available scant of ancient testimonial evidence alone doesn't provide adequate grounds to confirm it, the testimonial evidence is based largely on hearsay testimony from just 2 or 3 authors, what is the real reason you believe it?
Next.
The reason that we believe it is that we don't believe you, John.
Because I'm desperate, and I just have to have something to hold on to get me through the night, man. I mean, that's not a leading question at all.
Yeah, Christianity is just comforting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I've read the Sermon on the Mount. I've read Matthew 25. I've read the book of Revelation. It's not comforting. It's demanding. There are times it's comforting, and it certainly has kept me hopeful during the time of COVID. But no, it wouldn't be any comfort if I didn't think it was true.
That's right. That's right. There was a guy who wrote, his name was Sheldon Van Auken, and he had a correspondence with C.S. Lewis and became a Christian in that context. And Van Auken kept saying to Lewis, he reproduces these letters in his book, the name of which escapes me.
Severe Mercy.
Thank you, A Severe Mercy.
Yeah.
And he said, I'm afraid that I'm just wanting to be a Christian because it is, it's wish fulfillment. I wish so much for it to be true. And Lewis wrote to him and in essence said something to the effect, you probably actually have wishes on both sides. Would you really simply find this to be comforting if you believed it to be true? Wouldn't there to some extent be some things you wouldn't like about it if you believed it to be true? So Lewis said, just set all of that aside. Just set all of that motivist stuff aside and just examine whether it is true or not. And let's just go for that instead of hitting the person with an ad hominem. Even in a sense, Van Auken was doing an ad hominem on himself. Maybe I'm just wanting to believe this because, and that kind of thing. And Lewis said, it's worthless from an evidential point of view. Set that aside and look at the evidence.
I believe it's John Lennox who has this marvelous line. He's responding to something Dawkins once said to the effect that religion is a bunch of fairy tales that people tell themselves when they're afraid of the dark. And Lennox responded, well, I could equally well say that atheism is a collection of fairy tales that people tell themselves when they're afraid of the light. But that's really not to the point either way. Let's just move forward and look at the evidence.